The morning started the way most quiet mornings did in that town. Slow, deliberate, pretending nothing sharp lived underneath it. The sky was pale and undecided, the kind that made the river look like steel and the houses along the bank seem older than they really were. At 46, Evan Holt had learned to value those hours. Not because they were peaceful, but because they were honest. The world hadn't put on its mask yet. He stood on the back porch with a mug cooling in his hands, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods. The house was modest, clean, built for a life that was supposed to be simpler than the one he'd left behind. No flags, no photos on the walls that told stories people didn't need to hear. Inside, his daughter was getting ready for school. She moved around the kitchen with the careless confidence of someone who believed adults would always catch her if she fell. Backpack by the door, shoes kicked off where they didn't belong. A faint hum under her breath that followed no tune Evan recognized. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. Evan took a slow breath and stepped inside. Toast or eggs? He asked. Toast, she said, not looking up. Eggs make me late. He smiled despite himself and slid bread into the toaster. She was 12, old enough to think she understood the world, young enough not to know how quickly it could change. The drive to school was quiet, not awkward, just shared. She talked about a science project, about a teacher who talked too fast, about a rumor that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Evan listened the way he always did, fully without interrupting, storing details the way other people stored weapons. When she got out of the truck, she waved once and ran toward her friends. Evan waited until she disappeared inside before pulling away. That was the last normal moment he would have for a long time. The trouble didn't announce itself right away. It never did. It crept in through familiar names and old grudges, through family ties that had frayed quietly over years of polite distance. Evan hadn't spoken to his former father-in-law in months. Not out of anger, out of necessity. Some relationships didn't explode. They eroded. The man had never forgiven Evan for taking his daughter away from the orbit he controlled. Never forgiven him for surviving things that were supposed to break people. Never forgiven him for being calm when others wanted submission. The phone rang just after noon. Evan recognized the number immediately. He let it ring twice before answering. "What do you want?" he asked. The voice on the other end was thin with irritation, controlled, the kind of tone that pretended it was being reasonable. "We need to talk about your daughter," the man said. Evan felt something tighten behind his ribs. "She's not part of your conversations." A pause, then softer. "She's family." Evan's jaw set. "That hasn't meant much to you before." The call ended without resolution. No threats, no shouting. That was worse. By late afternoon, Evan was restless. He checked the locks, walked the perimeter of the property, drove past the school once more than necessary. Old habits surfaced without permission. The kind you never fully unlearn, no matter how long you pretend you're done with them. When the call came, it wasn't from family. It was from the sheriff's office. "Mr. Holt," the deputy said carefully. "There's been an incident." The world narrowed. "Where is she?" Evan asked. A pause too long to be professional. "County Medical," the deputy said. "She's stable." Evan was already moving. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet panic. Evan spotted her immediately. Small in the bed, arm-wrapped, bruises blooming in places no child should ever have to explain. She looked at him and tried to smile. "Dad," she whispered. "I'm okay." He took her hand carefully, gently, like the world might shatter if he squeezed too hard. "What happened?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Her eyes flicked toward the curtain. They were waiting, near the old lot. Him and his brothers." Evan closed his eyes once. "They said you needed to listen," she continued. "Said this would make you understand." The doctor spoke in calm phrases. Fractures, contusions, recovery, words that floated past Evan without landing. When the sheriff arrived, his posture was apologetic before he ever opened his mouth. "It's complicated," the sheriff said. "They've got connections. Statements don't line up. No clear witnesses." Evan looked at him steadily. "They beat a child with a bat," the sheriff swallowed. "For now, there's nothing I can do. Nothing. The words settled heavy in the room. Evan leaned down and pressed his forehead gently against his daughter's. "You did nothing wrong," he said. "I promise." She nodded, trusting him completely. That trust settled something, cold and immovable in Evan's chest. He walked out of the hospital without raising his voice, without making a scene, without telling anyone who he used to be. But as he stepped into the fading light of evening, one truth became impossible to ignore. Some men hid behind family, some hid behind badges, and some believed power meant immunity. They were about to learn the difference between being untouched and being unaccountable. And Evan Holt had never been very good at letting that stand. Evan didn't go home after the hospital. He drove until the town thinned into fields and the fields thinned into dark, pulling off near a stretch of river where the water ran fast and loud enough to drown thoughts if you let it. He sat with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slow until the tightness in his chest eased into something usable. Anger was loud. He didn't need loud. He needed clarity. By the time the sun dipped low, he had a list. Not written. Carried. Names he'd heard before and places he'd passed 100 times without seeing. The old lot near the grain silos. The hardware store that never closed on Sundays. The bar that changed its sign every few years but never its patrons. He went back to the hospital after dark. His daughter slept this time, face turned toward the wall, breathing even. Evan sat beside her and watched the rise and fall of her chest, committing the rhythm to memory the way he once memorized tides and currents. A nurse checked the monitors and nodded, offering reassurance without words. The sheriff didn't come back. That told Evan more than anything the man might have said. The next morning, Evan did what he always did when the world tried to corner him. He trained. Not theatrics, no rituals, just movement. A long run before sunrise, stretching joints that had carried weight across too many decks and shorelines. He worked his hands against resistance until the ache sharpened into focus. After, he showered, dressed, and drove to a place he hadn't visited since his marriage ended. The former father-in-law's property sat on a rise overlooking the river, fenced and manicured, a place built to suggest distance from consequences. Evan parked on the shoulder and watched for a while. Trucks came and went, men he recognized by posture if not by name, brothers who'd grown old together in the comfort of knowing the sheriff's number by heart. He didn't approach. He counted. By noon the calls started. First from a lawyer whose voice carried too much confidence. Then from a family friend who spoke like this was all a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right words. Evan listened without responding, letting them talk themselves into patterns. They wanted quiet. They wanted distance. They wanted time. Time was the one thing Evan wasn't going to give them. He returned to the hospital mid-afternoon. His daughter was awake now, propped on pillows, coloring with careful movements. She looked up and smiled, and the smile steadied him more than any breath exercise ever had. "They say I can go home soon," she said. "Good," Evan replied. "We'll make it comfortable." She hesitated. "Are they in trouble?" Evan considered the question carefully. "Not yet." She nodded, trusting him to know the difference. The sheriff finally called that evening. "I'm doing what I can," the man said, as if repetition made it true. "There are limits." Evan stood in the kitchen, lights off, looking out at the yard. "Limits don't apply to people who hurt children," the sheriff exhaled. "You don't understand how things work here." "I understand exactly how they work," Evan said. "I just don't accept them." The line went quiet. "Don't make this worse," the sheriff said at last. Evan ended the call. That night, Evan pulled a storage case from the back of a closet. Inside were items that hadn't seen daylight in years. Not weapons. Tools, gloves that fit like memory, tape, a radio with a scratched faceplate. He laid them out, then put most of them back. He wasn't going to do this the way people expected. He stepped outside and locked the door behind him, walking the property once more. The river moved on. Crickets sang. Somewhere in town, men drank and laughed, believing the law had settled things in their favor. Belief was a fragile thing. Before sleeping, Evan sat at the kitchen table and made a single call. The man on the other end didn't ask questions. He didn't offer advice. He listened. When Evan finished, the man said one thing. "If you pull this thread, the whole sweater comes apart." Evan nodded, even though the man couldn't see him. That's the idea. Morning came quietly. Evan drove to the hospital and helped his daughter into the truck, moving slowly, explaining every step. He took her home and set her up on the couch with pillows and her favorite blanket, the one she'd carried since she was small. He made soup, checked her medication, sat where she could see him. Outside, a pickup slowed at the end of the drive and then moved on. Evan watched it go. They were paying attention now. Good, because attention worked both ways, and Evan had learned long ago that when people believed themselves untouchable, the most effective response wasn't speed or spectacle. It was pressure, applied carefully, relentlessly, and always in the open. Pressure began quietly, not with threats or confrontations, but with interruptions. The kind that unsettled routines and exposed how much of a man's power depended on things running smoothly. The first interruption came at dawn, a call from the bank to the former father-in-law about an irregularity tied to a loan he'd quietly guaranteed for one of his brothers. Nothing criminal, just questions, requests for clarification. A delay on a line of credit he used to grease deals and settle favors. By mid-morning, the county assessor's office requested updated documentation on a parcel of land near the river, paperwork that had been overlooked for years, a technicality that suddenly mattered. By afternoon, an anonymous complaint reached the state labor board regarding unpaid overtime at the hardware store run by one of the brothers. Again, not catastrophic, just inconvenient. Evan Holt watched all of it unfold from a distance. He didn't make the calls himself. He didn't have to. He understood systems, how they leaned on compliance, how they reacted when attention shifted in their direction. A lifetime of planning operations had taught him that momentum could be redirected without ever stepping into view. That night he sat beside his daughter as she slept on the couch, her breathing steady, her color improving just enough to give him something to hold on to. The bruises were still there, the cast on her arm still awkward and foreign, but she was alive, and the men who hurt her were starting to feel something tighten around them. The former father-in-law noticed by the third day. His calls went unanswered. The sheriff stopped returning messages altogether. People who once laughed easily at his jokes suddenly needed to check schedules before committing to lunch. He drove out to Evan's place just after sunset, pulling into the gravel drive like he still belonged there. Evan met him outside, not confrontational, just present. "You've made your point," the older man said, voice sharp with irritation. "This has gone far enough." Evan didn't move. "You beat a child. She fell," the man snapped. "That's what the report says." Evan stepped closer. Not threatening, just close enough to be unavoidable. "You know better." The man's eyes flicked toward the house, toward the light in the living room where Evan's daughter slept. "This is family business," the man said. "The law doesn't need to be involved." Evan nodded once. It already was. It chose not to act. "And now you think you can punish us?" The man scoffed. Evan's voice remained even. "I think consequences exist whether you acknowledge them or not." The man laughed, but it sounded thin. "You don't scare me." Evan held his gaze. "I'm not here to scare you." The man left shortly after, tires spitting gravel as he reversed down the drive. The escalation came the following weekend. 2 men followed Evan when he went into town for supplies. Not subtle, not competent. They stayed a few car lengths back, trying to look casual while doing a poor job of it. Evan let them. He parked, went inside the store, came back out, loaded his truck slowly. When he drove off, they followed. When he turned onto a side road that led nowhere in particular, they stayed with him. He pulled over near an abandoned turnout by the river. The other vehicle stopped behind him. Evan stepped out calmly, hands visible. The 2 men exited their truck more cautiously. One reached inside his jacket, then stopped when Evan's eyes locked onto his. "Walk away," Evan said. One of them laughed nervously. "You don't get to tell us what to do." Evan nodded. "Then this will be educational." The encounter was brief. No shouting, no spectacle, just efficient movement. One man on the ground, breath knocked out of him. The other backed away quickly, realizing too late that he had misjudged both the situation and the man standing in front of him. Evan didn't pursue. He let them leave with the lesson intact. By Sunday night, the former father-in-law's phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Your situation is becoming difficult to manage," the voice said. "You need to rein in your people." The man shouted, threatened, demanded intervention. The voice waited him out. "You've been protected because you were useful," the voice continued. "You are no longer useful." The line went dead. Evan stood in his kitchen later that night, rinsing a cup in the sink, listening to the quiet return to his home. Outside, the river moved on as it always had. Inside, something had shifted. The men who believed they were untouchable were beginning to realize they had been mistaken, not because someone stronger had appeared, but because the structures they hid behind were withdrawing their support. Evan sat at the table and allowed himself one moment of stillness. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. And correction, once it began, had a way of continuing until the imbalance was gone. The first arrest didn't make the news. It happened early, before most of the town was awake, when deputies preferred to do their work without witnesses. One of the brothers was pulled over on a rural road and found to be driving on a suspended license. A minor thing, ordinarily forgettable. Except this time it stuck. No call to the sheriff fixed it. No favor smoothed it over. He spent the night in county holding, confused and furious, telling anyone who would listen that there had to be a mistake. There wasn't. Evan heard about it from a neighbor who thought it was just gossip. He nodded, thanked him, and went back to fixing a loose hinge on the back door. His daughter watched from the couch, coloring carefully around the edges of the page. "Why is everyone being weird lately?" she asked. Evan didn't look up. "Because some people are being asked questions they don't like." She seemed satisfied with that. The former father-in-law unraveled quickly after that. He drove into town and demanded meetings, with the sheriff, with the mayor, with anyone who used to answer his calls. Doors closed gently but firmly in his face. Smiles were polite. Explanations were vague. For the first time in decades, he was being told no. That afternoon, he showed up at Evan's house again. This time, he didn't get out of the truck. He rolled the window down halfway and spoke without looking directly at him. "You think this ends well for you?" he asked. Evan stood on the porch, hands loose at his sides. "I think it ends." The man scoffed. "You don't control this town." Evan nodded. "No, but neither do you." Silence stretched between them, thick with things neither of them wanted to say out loud. "You can still stop this," the man said finally. "Tell whoever you told to back off." Evan stepped closer to the truck, stopping just short of the door. "You hurt my daughter. You don't get to negotiate the response." The man's face tightened. "You're going to regret this." Evan's voice didn't change. "I already lived through worse." The truck pulled away slowly, tires crunching gravel like teeth. That night, the second brother made a mistake. He went drinking. Too much. Too public. He talked louder than he should have, bragging about how the sheriff wouldn't dare touch them. How family was family. How some people needed to be reminded of their place. Someone recorded it. The clip made its way to a state investigator who'd already been annoyed enough to start looking closer. By morning, subpoenas were being drafted. Financials were requested. Bank records flagged. The safety net was tearing. Evan didn't celebrate. He spent his time cooking, cleaning, helping his daughter with homework she pretended not to care about. He sat with her through the night when the pain made sleep difficult. He listened when she talked about school and didn't interrupt when she went quiet instead. She asked once if the men who hurt her would come back. Evan answered honestly, no. She believed him. The confrontation came sooner than Evan expected. Just after dusk, a car pulled into the drive and stopped without turning off its engine. The former father-in-law stepped out alone this time, shoulders slumped, confidence gone. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. Evan studied him carefully. "You swung a bat at a child." The man flinched. "It was supposed to scare you." Evan's eyes hardened. "You don't scare children to make a point." The man looked away. "They're turning on us, everyone. I can't stop it." Evan nodded. "You were never in control. What do you want?" the man asked quietly. Evan considered the question. "Accountability." The man laughed weakly. "That's not how this town works." Evan took a step back, signaling the conversation was over. "It is now." By the end of the week, indictments followed. Not just for the assault, but for things that had been buried for years. Fraud, coercion, tax evasion, patterns no one had wanted to connect until they were forced to. The sheriff took medical leave. An interim replacement arrived from outside the county. Change didn't come all at once. It came like water through cracks. And Evan knew the final reckoning wasn't about fists or force. It was about standing still while the truth finally caught up to the people who had run from it their whole lives. He sat at the kitchen table that night, listening to his daughter breathe from the next room, and understood something clearly. The hardest part wasn't starting this. It was seeing it through. The courtroom was smaller than Evan expected. Low ceiling, wood paneling that had dulled with age. A place built for routine disputes and quiet compromises, not the kind of reckoning that had been circling this town for years. Evan sat in the second row, hands folded loosely in his lap, posture relaxed but alert. He wore plain clothes, nothing that suggested who he used to be or what he was capable of. That part of his life stayed folded away unless it was needed. His daughter sat beside him, arms still in a sling, feet not quite reaching the floor. She leaned into his side without looking around, trusting him to be the boundary between her and the room. Across the aisle, the former father-in-law avoided looking in their direction. The brothers sat together. Older now, smaller somehow. Men who had spent decades mistaking familiarity for immunity. When the prosecutor spoke, there was no drama, no raised voice, just facts laid out carefully, one after another, until denial no longer had anywhere to stand. Medical reports, witness statements, a timeline that didn't care about family ties. The bat was entered into evidence. Evan felt his daughter tense beside him. He shifted slightly, grounding her with the simple pressure of his presence. She didn't look away. The defense tried what Evan knew they would: character witnesses, appeals to history. The suggestion that things had gotten out of hand without intent, that emotions had been high, that people sometimes made mistakes. The prosecutor waited patiently. Then she stood and asked one question. Would you call striking a child with a bat a mistake? Silence swallowed the room. Outside, the town waited. People gathered on sidewalks, pretending they had errands. Conversations stopped when the courthouse doors opened. Everyone wanted to see who walked out standing tall and who didn't. When the verdict came, it was clean. Guilty. On all counts. Sentencing was set for a later date, but the damage was already done. The myth of protection had shattered in open air. The men who had relied on silence now faced something far more dangerous. Records, consequences, time. The sheriff never returned to duty. An investigation into his handling of prior complaints widened quietly, then not so quietly. The interim replacement stayed. Policies changed. Old favors expired. Evan didn't watch any of it closely. He didn't need to. His part was almost finished. That evening, he took his daughter for a drive. They followed the river road out of town, windows cracked, air cool and clean. She talked about school, about a friend who had visited, about how she was tired of explaining her caste. Evan listened. When they stopped at a turnout overlooking the water, she asked the question he'd known was coming. Are they going away? Yes, Evan said, for a long time. She nodded, absorbing it slowly. They won't hurt anyone else? No, he replied, not like this. She leaned her head against the window. Good. They sat there until the sun dipped low enough to turn the river copper. Later that night, Evan stood alone on the porch, looking out at the dark. The urge to keep pushing tugged at him, to make sure nothing could ever crawl back out of the cracks. He recognized the feeling for what it was. Habit. He let it pass. Justice didn't need pursuit anymore. It needed patience. Inside, his daughter slept peacefully for the first time since the attack. Her breathing deep and even, the kind that came from safety rather than exhaustion. Evan checked the locks once, not twice. That was enough. The town would talk about this for years. They would say things like, "You don't know what really happened," or "There was more to the story." They would soften it, reshape it, try to make it comfortable enough to forget. Evan didn't care. He hadn't done this for the town. He'd done it for the child sleeping under his roof, and as he turned off the porch light and stepped inside, he understood something that had taken him most of his life to learn. Strength wasn't what you used to break something. It was what you used to stop. And tomorrow, for the first time since the phone call from the sheriff, he would wake up without needing to plan for what came next. The work was almost done. Sentencing came quietly. No cameras, no crowd pressing against the courthouse doors. Just paperwork, procedure, and the slow weight of finality settling where arrogance used to live. Evan Holt sat in the same seat he had taken before, posture unchanged. His daughter was not with him this time. He had promised her she wouldn't need to hear any more details, and he kept his promises. The judge spoke without flourish. Years, consecutive, no early release considerations discussed aloud. The words landed evenly one after another like stones placed carefully on a scale. The former father-in-law stood when ordered, hands trembling despite his effort to look composed. The brothers followed, faces hollow, eyes darting toward exits that no longer mattered. None of them looked at Evan. They didn't need to. Outside, the air felt lighter, not relieved, not celebratory, just unburdened. Evan drove home along the river road, windows down, letting the sound of water fill the cab. He passed places that had once felt like choke points and saw them now for what they were. Just land, just road, just distance. At home, his daughter met him at the door. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yes," Evan said. "It's over." She nodded, then surprised him by throwing her arms around his waist, careful of her healing arm but firm everywhere else. He held her there, steady and present, letting the moment settle without trying to explain it. They made dinner together that night. Nothing special. Soup, bread, food that didn't demand attention. Afterward, they sat on the couch and watched something mindless until she fell asleep against his shoulder. Evan didn't move until he was sure she was fully out. Later, alone, he stood in the quiet of the kitchen and thought about the road that had led him here, the years in uniform, the deployments that had taught him how quickly order could collapse and how discipline could rebuild it, the marriage that had failed not because of cruelty but because some people carried storms inside them longer than others could endure. He thought about how close he'd come to crossing lines that didn't lead back, and how restraint in the end had done more damage to the right people than violence ever could. The town would recover. It always did. New names would fill old roles. Someone else would eventually test the boundaries again, but not today, and not on his watch. In the weeks that followed, Evan returned to routine. School drop-offs, work, evenings spent helping, with homework or listening to stories that had nothing to do with courts or hospitals or fear. His daughter laughed more easily, slept through the night, slowly stopped flinching at sudden noises. Healing didn't announce itself. It just showed up one quiet moment at a time. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the river caught the last of the light, Evan sat on the porch and let the day end without planning for the next one. He didn't need contingency maps anymore. He didn't need to anticipate threats in every shadow. The work that mattered had been done, not by breaking anything, but by standing firm long enough for the truth to catch up. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.